Hi, I'm Andrew Wallace, and welcome to the We've Got a Problem podcast. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we make decisions, why we make decisions, and whether there might be a way to lean on the advice of smarter, older people to stop having to reinvent the wheel all the time. And I got a chance to talk to Jason Murchie, who founded a company called Values of the Wise. He's also written 4 books on wisdom, values, and virtues, and he just seemed like the kind of person I wanted to talk to give me the answers to some fundamental questions. With a background in clinical psychology, ethics, philosophy, it just seemed like a line drive. We talked for about an hour. We got into the weeds on a couple of different things. So to give listeners kind of the broadest overview possible, I've edited the episode down quite a bit. If you think you'd like to hear the longer version, drop me a message on Instagram and let me know, and I'll consider posting at a later date. With that, let's get into it. Jason, welcome to the show, author of Wisdom, a very valuable virtue that cannot be bought. How did you get into writing a book about wisdom?
It was a combination of my trajectory was just kind of heading in that direction over the last 18 or 20 years since I began that enterprise you mentioned called Values of the Wise. I've been interested in what is this thing called wisdom? Who are these people that we consider wise? How do we know if they're wise? What does it mean to be wise? What are their lives like? And how can we emulate them to the degree that each of us is capable of that? And so, in asking which are the values that wise people are attracted to and seek to cultivate within themselves, obviously wisdom has to be one of them, right? If not the foremost. So there's that thread. And then there was the pandemic. I was more bored and more unsettled than usual. Had some time, was watching the news. It's, for me,
and noticing the kind of lack of wisdom that is kind of displayed on the news regularly. Yeah.
No, it's true. In fact, it's probably, wisdom's interesting in that you know it when you see it, but you also know it when you see the opposite of it. And I have a tendency to, talk back to the news, something you imagine like Larry David doing. And so I've taken to trying to restrain myself, be a little more diplomatic and say, quote, that is extremely unwise. Yeah, I just wanted to delve all the way into the topic as deeply as possible. I should also say my hat's off to a person named Stephen Hall. He wrote a wonderful book in 2010 called, Wisdom from Philosophy to Neuroscience. And his book was very impactful. I thought he did such a fantastic job. I kind of use it as a springboard, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, I think that's a common way that a lot of these new works come out these days, because we're always expanding on each other and diving more deeply into it. The latest, greatest, bestseller book in the personal growth space, I think, is Atomic Habits by James Clear, and of course, he's expanding on the work of the guy who wrote The Power of Habit. To take something and bring it into practical application is really what I think you've done with wisdom. I could not get over how well researched it was as far as the quotes, how much reinforcement I got every time I read a chapter. This is the case. You've heard this before. Here are the words of not just me, but also other people in support of all these things. Quote after quote after quote. Because when you write these kinds of things, it's so easy for people to dismiss it and go, well, this is just one guy's opinion. Seeing these values portrayed in that way, I found hugely impactful and informative.
Thank you so much. It also tells me some things about you, because different people see the book differently. I happen to like the way you're describing it. So, thumbs up on that. There's this quote that I've remembered for quite some time. It's by Dale Carnegie. Yep. He said, the ideas I stand for are not mine. I borrowed them from Socrates. I swiped them from Chesterfield. I stole them from Jesus, and I put them in a book. If you don't like their rules, whose would you use? So
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
Wisdom, like you say in the book, is impossible to define in a way, but you know it when you see it. Leaning on wisdom, on history, on the standing on the shoulders of giants to figure things out is one time-tested way to make things happen. It may not be a way to guarantee success, but it's certainly a way to avoid having to reinvent the wheel on your way to success. In your book, you say that wise people value love, kindness, altruism, and generosity. There's a lot of evidence, we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, that we haven't been placing much for premium on those kinds of virtues. I mean, look at our prison population. Can you talk to me about how wisdom might be the answer?
Well, I think what you say is correct. Obviously, the values of the wise is a very broad collection of values and virtues, and of course, they are arguable. The things that we should believe are the things that have more evidence to support them, in my opinion. Therefore, if you look into things like love and compassion and empathy and generosity and caring and such, it's hard to find counter evidence.
I mean, you pointed out in the book that the kind of love, kindness, altruism, generosity works. The fact that we've got an epidemic level proportion of people incarcerated in this country is just mind-blowing. And it seems to be a lack of focus, perhaps, on some of those values and virtues.
It's true. They didn't get that compassion and love and, let alone unconditional love from people in their early years. And therefore, it's really hard for them to deal with that riptide or whatever. You have a hard time swimming against it. I was listening to David Letterman interviewed Tiffany Haddish, the actress and comedian, the other day, and she had a pretty rough childhood, like really rough, actually. And some people have the ability to be resilient and turn those lemons into lemonade, and she's fascinating in how she has done that. Kevin Hart is kind of another example, incidentally, of somebody who really pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. But just from the societal perspective, one of the reasons that I tend to be more progressive than libertarian or anything is that I think it's important to make sure that those people who are just plain average or even below average in some ways don't have to do this Herculean level Horatio Alger type thing where they pull themselves up by their bootstraps against all odds and maybe succeed. I think a person should only have to just kind of walk the path. They don't have to be extraordinary to, get out of the ghetto or extraordinary to deal with being ostracized in their school. There are things that conservatives and liberals should be able to agree on. This would be one of them, in the sense that if we can find ourselves enlightened by the quotation, we would do better to spend money on education than on prisons, because you're going to spend money on one of the two. And right. So I think it is much more humane and logical to spend less money now on those things that, frankly, Republicans in Congress don't like to vote for a lot of times. Head Start and pre-K and nutrition programs, so that, it's likelier that person can be, taken off the track that they're on. And of course, Republicans are probably correct in pointing to the idea that schools are really they're just messed up. And that's really sad too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's been a lot of research and stuff lately about how, I think Chicago was a case study for this, how they kind of gerrymander their school districts, that you can live one block away and be shoved into a poor school district because they've drawn the map around your apartment building. The thing for me when it comes to education is, and I come from it as an educated economist, that's my degree. Economics, I geek out about economics because it goes, here's how it's supposed to work. And we're living out an economic nightmare right now where we're getting into a wage price spiral and all these horrible things are happening. But the fact becomes education is one of those things that gives you huge positive externalities. Far beyond what you spend on education, you get way more back, not just an educated populace that's more productive as workers. And I'm not saying our goal is to make everybody a perfect worker and lemming, but everybody wants better educated people. There is no downside. None of this stuff is bad. That gets us into something else that you talk about in the book. You talk about the fact that a wise person can effectively regulate emotions, that you experience them, you have them without letting them run the show in a way. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, there's a chapter called Wisdom involves emotion regulation, emotional intelligence, and integration. I didn't invent the idea of emotional intelligence, obviously, but I think there's really something to that. And Stephen Hall thinks that's absolutely true, the author that I referenced earlier. I have a background as a psychotherapist, and that makes perfect sense. Emotions they're the spice of life. They're wonderful. Research shows that if you happen to have a brain trauma and you cannot experience any emotion, and interestingly, there have been cases, you become kind of a dud because you can't really live as a human without emotion. Mm-hmm. On one hand, you could maybe picture somebody just kind of sitting around in a chair. They can't really prioritize very well and motivate themselves well. On the other hand, the worst case scenario is probably the sociopath, somebody who has no emotion and yet the rest of their brain works very, very well. There are a lot of sociopaths who work, in society and they cover their tracks very well. They have high-level jobs. It's like they live a secret life where they really don't give a about anybody but themselves, but they still are the CEO. Anyway, emotion regulation, extremely important. You try not to let emotions, which are termed the part of the brain where emotions tend to reside, is called the lizard brain because it's very evolutionarily old. The brain has evolved slowly, and you think of it like a baseball with a softball surrounding that and a cantaloupe surrounding that. So the baseball is basically the lizard brain, the part of the brain that just helped humans survive. The more sophisticated parts of the brain that would be considered maybe like the neocortex, wherever, the part that's on the top, near the front, things like this, that is the most evolutionarily recently developed. And that's the stuff that is, the most sophisticated thing perhaps in the universe. We have an amazing ability to manage and execute and synthesize, integrate, invent. So emotions, although they can be beautiful, right? How could you have love, that feeling of love, the thing that gets your heart racing? How could you have that without emotion? So very important to be able to integrate it into your whole being so that you don't, go from crisis to crisis.
The idea of emotional regulation is that balance that comes with experiencing them, not closing yourself off from emotion. But how do you maintain the appropriate level, that emotional regulation, not elimination, to walk that line? Like it's a delicate balance.
I think that it has something to do with, how should I say, you feel an emotion. The question is, why do you feel that way? If it's an appropriate emotion, like let's say you get hit by a car and your child dies, the only appropriate response is to fall on the floor and sob endlessly or whatever. However, something will get stuck in my craw, I'll just seethe with anger. And that's a pernicious thing, right? To be so angry that and feel out of control and just let the emotion kind of run wild. So I think a lot of the success with emotion is, how do you interpret it? How do you add some cognition to it? How do you feel it and then let it go? How do you do something productive with it?
Part of it is recognizing when it's happened. It is being an adult a little bit when it comes to emotional regulation, of recognizing that you're having an emotion and taking one step back and going, wow, I'm really frustrated with this right now. And perhaps even being honest with other people and going, you know what? I need to take a walk around the block for a minute. People who seem to lack some ability of emotional regulation are much more like children. The emotions run the show. You mentioned that insight and intuition are features of wisdom. And yet one could argue that the way that so many of us acted during the COVID pandemic was the result of relying too much on intuition, or perhaps trusting objectively flawed intuition or undeveloped intuition. How can we ensure that our intuition is solid?
Some of it does have to do with the fact that just because a person has an intuition, a feeling, that voice in their head that combines with emotion causing them to say, this is how I feel, this is what I think, this is true, this is correct, this is what I should do. Just because those things are happening doesn't mean it's true or correct or valid or wise. Unfortunately, it's only gotten worse since the advent of the internet, because now everybody thinks they're an expert. Everybody's incensed about something. They want to argue.
The part of the thing for me when it comes to all that stuff is, okay, intuition is your starting point, but that's not the whole name of the game. I have a little bit of an intuition on this. Great. Now let me see if I can verify that is true. And now on the internet, you can get anything to confirm your bias by doing a quick Google search that turns up something that may have no scientific validation or basis, but is easy to find and reinforce. And you just put yourself in this echo chamber, because that's how the internet works, where it's just your confirmation bias machine going around and around and around again and again and again. One Bertrand Russell quote that stood out to me, which I've heard before but bears repeating again, is the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wise people are so full of doubts. And why is that the case? I mean, it relates a little bit to modesty as well, I think. And part of the question there is, do we have any left?
This is kind of all about wisdom, right? Because, the way that it operates where the rubber hits the road is you're really not as wise as you think you are in a particular topic, because obviously knowledge is just like the building blocks that can potentially make up wisdom. And it would be an unwise person who says something that is not true, not defensible, but they happen to have a fervent belief in it.
I mean, we're just going to commiserate here for forever, but I get that feeling that we've somehow managed to say that your opinion is the same as my facts.
Right.
That just true. Because you feel that way makes it just as valid and true as something that I can demonstrate to the world in a scientific fashion is the way it is. And I feel that's not the case, and that we need to then have a dialogue about that.
Everybody believes that their opinion is like, as soon as it enters their mind that they have an opinion on something, they think, I have to share this with the world. It's like, just have a little more modesty. In my opinion, I would urge people like that to have more modesty and realize that you're just one person. You're probably not any more special than anybody else. Manage your own situation. That's probably a challenge enough. I know that my life is a challenge enough. I shouldn't be spending a lot of time taking other people's inventory and worrying about their lives. I should be worrying about mine, because there's so much opportunity for me to improve myself.
Right. Well, that's, as a guest recently said to me, he goes, look, people are always worried about what other people think, and they want other people to think something, right? They're trying to also guide other people's thoughts. But at the end of your life, you're not going to be judged on what other people thought. You're going to be judged on what you thought, what you did, what you were. And it seems to me, if nothing else, short-sighted, if not unwise, to lack the humility, presence of mind, foresight, all those things when going into these kinds of situations. Jason, it's been a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want to know more about Jason, check out his book, Wisdom, A Very Valuable Virtue That Cannot Be Bought. Also on his website at Values of the Wise, links in the description. Thank you guys so much for joining me. And until next time, I'm Andrew Wallace, and we don't have a problem. We've got an opportunity.